Hello everyone and welcome back. I realized this year that I have been professionally costuming for 20 years, which is a terrifying number. And during that time I have had all sorts of amazing successes and all sorts of wonderful failures to learn from. But I only started my YouTube about 2 years ago. There's 18 years that I haven't had the chance to share with you, and every single time a little bit makes its appearance, I get a lot of questions about it. So I thought this might be the perfect time to go over the things that I have made in the almost 20 years leading up to YouTube. Now, because this is an incredibly concerningly extensive list, I had to limit it down a bit. I'm sticking to just historical costumes for the purposes of this video. I'm not getting into the weeds with my vintage things, though I have worn vintage clothing for almost 20 years as well. That will be its own video someday very soon. And I'm also sticking to the things that I have made for myself, because I've actually extensively made things for other people as well. I worked in theater for a number of years, I even did costuming for movies, though this one never actually got officially released. I worked at Colonial Williamsburg building costumes for the employees behind the scenes as well as in front of the public in 18th century clothing, making clothing as it would have been made back then. And I ran my own business for a number of years making historical clothing for other people. So that is a lot of stuff, and I don't have pictures of most of that, nor do I have permission to share all of those pictures of other people. So we're sticking to just the historical costumes that I've made for myself. But don't worry, that's still almost 70 things. And concerningly, I still actually have most of the things that I'm talking about, which is part of the reason I'm doing this video. I'm reaching a point where I'm getting ready to let go of a lot of these things. So if you want to keep an eye out on that, head over to my Instagram. I will eventually be selling a good chunk of what you see today on that platform in the very near future. But in trying to let go of them, I feel like I need to spend a little bit more time remembering them and honoring them, because I have been through so much with these garments and I have learned so much. The journey is not linear or without its bumps, but there are so many amazing things along the way. And we get to dial all the way back. I was in college for costume design at the time at Ball State University and was doing plenty of historical and vintage inspired clothing for theatrical productions, but I really wanted to spend some more time learning about the layers and the complexity of some of these other garments that were a bit more than we could put on stage. So I started off with this massive project well before I really understood what I was doing. In fact, I made a fairly thorough ensemble, made a corset, a bustle, the skirt, and the bodice. All of these things were made out of a remnant that I purchased at a discount store in Chicago for $1 a yard that was stretch suiting. If the first thought you had was stretch suiting for a corset, I really hope she had a foundation layer. I did not. I had no idea what I was doing, but I learned a lot about draping and patterning and fitting and dealing with historical body shapes, and I started to learn why understructures were really important. When I graduated from college, I had trouble finding a job in theater, and I ended up finding a job at Colonial Williamsburg working in their costume design center, which is behind the scenes making all of the clothing for the people out on the streets and in the trade shops. And I thought the best way that I could approach this was to learn about 18th century clothing. So I took it upon myself to make a full 18th century ensemble, the best I could, with historically accurate hand sewing and historically accurate fabrics. And I made this entire ensemble based off of the Costume Close-Up book, and I'm still really proud of this. It is not historically accurate, and I know that now. I didn't know that at the time. But I still actually have the stays that I made for this ensemble. They were at one point altered to fit better and have better construction. As for the outer garments, the petticoat was a hand-dyed linen that was far too loose of a weave to be hand sewing on. The jacket was made out of a quilting cotton that is not a period accurate print and was absolutely horrible to stitch through by hand. That was a huge leap for me. I'm still so proud of my 2007 self for managing to make something like that without any external references outside of that one book. As soon as I arrived in Williamsburg, I started realizing that I had a long way to go and a lot to learn. I picked up a few commercial patterns for 18th century gowns, and I made this dress in a very large toile print, which is not the best idea for a gown. Not that prints didn't exist, or even that there aren't examples of twill printed gowns. There technically is one, but this was not something that was appropriate for a gown because it's such a large print, and it engulfed the gown and engulfed me. I then moved on to making a Marie Antoinette inspired gown. I somehow had happened across this beautiful silk on major sale, so I made a cutaway style polonaise-ish, vaguely accurate, vaguely Marie Antoinette movie style gown with polyester ruffles and a mix of hand and machine sewing. It was at that point that I started attending workshops from Burnley and Trowbridge and moved forward at incredible speeds. The first workshop I attended was for a cutaway style gown, and I made a black and white striped version with death's head buttons down the front. I attended another B&T workshop on making stays from Mark Hutter, learned all of the things I did wrong in the construction and in the fit of my previous pair. I then also attended a writing habit workshop where I took everything to the next level and started realizing I love tailoring. This is such an exciting concept to me, and I poured so much time and love and effort into these garments because I wanted to soak up any amount of knowledge that I possibly could from them. And I took what I learned, and with full audacity, believing that I understood what I was doing, I went into my next project. And that was reproducing this floral print jacket. It inherently doesn't look too complex, but the more you start to look at the details of it, the more it is not a typical pattern. In fact, the sleeves are cut in one with the back and wrap around. The front is a very unusual shape as well, and the whole thing is just an absolute mess of design when it comes to draping. And I was determined to do it, and I somehow did it. I still to this day don't understand how I accomplished that. I think I probably went through about 10 different mock-ups, and I don't even want to know how many hours of effort to figure this out. I felt so proud of myself. I then spent the next couple years, 2009, 2010, just making a whole bunch of basic stuff. I needed clothing for working my evening position where I was taking tour groups around the historic area, and I just needed practical plain clothing for that. And I went with just simple wools and linens, things for summer weather, winter weather, really basics. And I continued to make basics like this throughout my time working at Colonial Williamsburg because I constantly needed new stuff. Yes, they did issue me clothing, but no, that was not up to my personal standards in terms of fit or comfort. So I spent a lot of time making workwear. But in 2011, I picked back up with trying to make more complex pieces. I did another workshop on making a Brunswick style jacket. Did this one out of a yellow corded silk, really stiff to work with, but absolutely sublime in winter, and I'm pretty sure this was the only thing that kept me from completely freezing when I was working some of the evening programs in the middle of winter. I also did another workshop on making polonaise gowns, and that brought me into a whole new world of draping where it was no longer fitted to the body, but we had all these complex pleats and tucks that had to shape something in such an unusual way and drape it around the figure. I also spent untold hours hand whipping all of these gathers into this trim. That is still absolutely mind-blowing to me how much time that must have taken. I then started whipping things up really fast, such as this little striped silk jacket for an evening event with some friends, as well as this polonaise style jacket that was meant for one of the summer programs that takes place, and so I needed something that could manage the heat because silk cannot manage June heat in Virginia. This is also when I made my first pair of shoes that didn't fit. Shoes are definitely a separate thing from this video. I also started to get involved with more groups of other costumers at this point in time. So I needed a whole new range of wardrobes for a whole new range of eras. A friend invited me to go down to the Pirate Festival in Hampton Roads, so suddenly I needed a pirate outfit. I chose to do a wool jacket from around the 1720s that was vaguely historically based, but with a little bit of extra spin with the nautical buttons there. I also made this 1790s evening gown, which though I did use machine embroidery, I wasn't as familiar with that process, so it took me a lot of time to design the embroidery and digitize everything and then get the whole system set up. There were still a lot of hand embroidered sections, such as all the little sprigs. The sequins had to be attached by hand as well, and it was so much time and effort to put this together. It's gorgeous, and I admit this is one of the pieces that I likely will never part with while I'm still alive because it does mean so much to me. I've also moved into the early 19th century to try out my hand at Regency clothing, which is weirdly where I think a lot of costumers actually start. It took me quite a few years to get there, but I made a simple brown cotton ensemble through one of the workshops and then went on to make my first version of this tambour gown, which might be familiar to you because I made a new version of it a couple years ago. I also, as if this wasn't enough, in 1 year, mind you, all of this from the Brunswick forward has been 2011. I also was invited to go with friends to an 1860s event in Gettysburg in November, which meant that I not only needed a full 1860s day ensemble, but I needed a heavyweight outer garment to go over it. So I needed to make the chemise, the corset, the cage crinoline, the petticoat, the gown, the paletot, bonnet. Everything had to be very quickly assembled for this event. I'm very glad that I went with a really classic basic style. I knew this wasn't an era that I was going to do very often, and I wanted an ensemble that was going to manage different weather and different types of events, so that way I wasn't going to have to constantly make new outfits for this one time period. You might find this as familiar from Abby's Are You Hot in That video way back at the beginning of her YouTube, in which we discovered that wool dress actually does surprisingly well in the summer heat. Moving on to 2012, I was no less prolific in this year, but I didn't make much 18th century clothing. The only thing of note is this chemise gown based off of this particular portrait. I was mostly inspired to do that particular ensemble because I'd never made a chemise gown with the gathered front style before, and Berlin Trowbridge had this particular cotton gauze fabric with this lovely stripe in it that looked just like the portrait. I knew I had to do it. It was such an iconic look. That gown has since been remade a bit, as you'll see very shortly. This was also the year that I started attending a lot of events as not so much a vendor, but as a teacher of sorts. I would be at these events teaching about shoemaking, sewing, and historic fashion, and that was a great opportunity for me to get out and talk with the public, teach people about fashion and about shoemaking and women in trades, and all of those different things. So for me, historic costuming was more than just pretty dresses. It was also very much an educational experience. So many of the garments that I was making were getting laid out for the public to handle and look at closely, hence why all hand stitching and historically accurate materials inside and out was so incredibly important to me at that time. Venturing into other time periods was also pretty essential as I expanded my repertoire in order to do these presentations. My first new era was the 19-teens. In the previous year, I had actually tried making my first entire 19-teens evening gown based directly off of the Janet Arnold Patterns of Fashion series, trying to learn how all of the different layers were put together, what was going on inside of those garments, because they are incredibly complex for how simple they look on the outside. And I theoretically had nowhere to wear that garment. It was just meant to be a practice run of the 19-teens for the event the next year. But I ended up taking it on a cruise with me and wearing it for an evening dinner on the cruise ship, much to the surprise of everyone else in normal modern clothing. But the next year, I actually was able to go to a 1912 event at a friend's house with a large group of costumers, and we did a big dinner in formal gowns where I made a different 19-teens gown, where I learned a lot from the first one, because it wasn't just a matter of the construction techniques and the layers, it was also a matter of using the correct materials, and that was a big lesson for me at this point in time. For the same event, I also made this Poiret-inspired ensemble that was meant for the more casual after party that we were all going to be lounging about on pillows in the basement, and I needed something much more comfortable, and I only knew that I really wanted something that I could put tassels on. That was my entire inspiration for this garment, which is still one of the favorite ones that I've made, though it's very simple. I also attended my first steampunk convention ever. I went to TeslaCon that fall with a friend, and I found a whole new genre and a whole new era to love. So I ended up making 2-day ensembles and 1 evening ensemble for this, and these are still some of my absolute favorite pieces. I have since reworked my navy suit in order to be a little bit more historically accurate with a longer style of skirt and a better fit to the bodice. I also made this burgundy wool in the early 1900s ensemble with embroidery on the collar, and probably the piece that I am the most proud of from this era of my costuming is this evening gown. It was the first time I ever invested in a silk satin, and I spent so much time trying to understand the internal structures of these bodices, how they were put together, mixing in some of my costuming knowledge in order to drape out this incredibly elaborate bustle gown, which ironically actually went over the bustle that I made all the way back for that 1870s style. I've actually never made a replacement bustle for this gown, interestingly enough, now that I think about it. But I spent a lot of time and effort trying to understand this era and how to structurally build it up. In 2013, I took on a full-time day job for most of the year, so I had to dial back on the amount of costumes I was making for myself. I did quite quickly make what I deemed my Ghost Bride ensemble to go with my friend to Disney World for their Halloween event, where you are allowed to go in costume, and the Bride in the Attic was my inspiration. I also tried some experimental 18th century with this wrap style gown based off of portrait. I couldn't entirely tell what was going on, so I mixed and matched knowledge of quite a few different garments of the 18th century in order to try and come up with what it was. But I was challenging myself to try new things because the 18th century can start to feel really repetitive very quickly. In 2014, I remade my lemon silk gown from all the way back at the beginning of my time at Williamsburg. That Marie Antoinette inspired gown was no longer going to serve its purpose for me, but that fabric was absolutely divine, and I had quite a bit of yardage left over, so I took it apart and put it back together in a different style, taking my time to do it much more historically accurately, do some beautiful trim on it, and this is the only time I've really made a formal 18th century dress, something that would be court appropriate. It's not by any means the highest level of formality, but it does require side hoops, and it's definitely a pretty fancy style. And I can see the huge difference in terms of fit and construction methods between these two dresses made out of the exact same fabric with pretty similar ideas for their stylings. I also had to quite rapidly make a few other garments that year, including an 1820s gown for yet another educational event where I was talking about shoemaking, but it was in an era that I'd never done before, so I very quickly put together this lightweight gown for summer out of a sheer lavender cotton. I have to admit, it's not my favorite era, but I think I didn't fit the gown quite perfectly to my shoulders, and there's still a lot to learn in any new time period, then I just didn't have the time for that. I also didn't have the time for the next ensemble, which is my 1670s red silk gown. I ended up needing this for a large film shoot at Bacon's Castle where we were doing advertisements for the site and going through lots of different time periods. I changed from 1670s to 1740s to 1940s, all in the span of one day. So I volunteered to make a very quick ensemble for myself. Though for some reason, I don't know why I thought this was a good idea, I hand-stitched the entire thing. That was a terrible choice considering I had about a week and a half to do this. And in the end, it wasn't completely finished, and it came up beautifully if you don't look too closely. And it has since been fixed up a little bit and was actually used for some of my earliest videos of doing a historically accurate Hocus Pocus cosplay where Abby wore it in the character of Sarah. 2015 was actually my last year in Williamsburg. I moved that year, but I managed to squeeze out a few more things before I left. I came across this silk fabric with all these tiny little sprigs that just looked absolutely perfect for 1780s, and I knew I had to make one of these gowns before I moved because I would never have a reason to do it again. So Abby assisted me in fitting that and getting it made up as quickly as possible. I did have to completely interline the skirt because the threads carry across between each one of those sprigs, and it is dangerous inside otherwise. But this was my final 18th century garment before I moved away. I did still manage to attend TeslaCon that year, in which the theme was the Wild West, so I spent some time researching what dance hall girls would have worn in that era. I had a great time embroidering this. It's a little bit anachronistic in the choice of embroidery styles and designs, but it is of the era. It's just not the type of embroidery they typically would have done. I did also learn a valuable lesson when it came to this bodice. The body of it is crumpling in front. I didn't stitch the boning up quite as far as I needed to. I didn't have structure underneath to support my chest, and so the whole thing just kind of crumpled. Pictures will forever remind me as to why understructures are very important, or if you don't want understructures, why you have to build more structure into your bodices. I also made a Harlequin outfit, or Harley Quinn outfit, for one of the evening events in which I was combining a Harley Quinn cosplay with the Harlequin costumes that were pretty popular for fancy dress events in the late 19th century. So it's vaguely late 1880s mixed with a bit of punk. Instead of patches, I used big antique brooches that I had inherited from my grandmother. I also went down to New Orleans with a group of friends for the Battle of New Orleans 1815 bicentennial event. It took place in January, so it was likely going to be a little cold, a little damp. So I made a whole range of garments that were meant to be layered up depending on what I needed. But this is where the green dress and Spencer jacket that I altered for my video a couple years back comes from, all of its little leaf patterns around. I also made a wool pelisse trimmed in velvet to go over the whole thing for the colder weather, and also had to make a proper ball gown. This is not admittedly my favorite era for evening gowns, so I struggled a little bit. So this lavender piece just dripping in pearls and puffs was born. I admit this is not quite my usual style and I wasn't the most comfortable in this ensemble, but I still love it. I just learned a lot about making sure that things work for me as much as they actually work. 2016 for me became the year of tailoring challenges. I made this 19-teens rust wool suit and worked on doing all of the proper internal structures and tailoring. I had tailored some things before, but hadn't done a ton, and definitely didn't spend as much time learning about it as I wanted to. This was also the precursor to my next tailoring challenge, which was a proper 1900s tailcoat. I altered it to fit my figure a little bit differently, but still did all of the tailoring that would have been present in these very formal garments, which is a lot. That was worn to costume college for gala that year because that was actually the year that everyone was making these huge, grand, amazing gowns, such as Cynthia making her iron work Worth gown, and I felt uninspired by most of the evening gowns that I was looking at the time. And I knew that there was nothing that I could do in the amount of time and energy that I had for this project that would stand up to what everyone else was doing. So I decided to go a completely different route, and I'm very glad that I did. I also entered into graduate school that year, so sewing became a little bit more limited and focused on a couple events here or there, or important things for school. In 2017, for example, I went back to TeslaCon. I made a new chartreuse wool suit with all of the GIMP trims, some of which is definitely dying and needs to be replaced, as I've talked about in a previous video. I also made this 1900s ensemble that was based off of one of the jackets in the University of Nebraska Lincoln collection that I had been looking at, which had a very unusual method of putting cording into the sleeves using a double needle. Really wanted to try doing that, but the rest of the garment was pretty simple, just antique beaded piece that I added to the front of the vest. I also made a very simple black velveteen 1890s evening gown because at that point pretty much everything that I had made for previous steampunk things no longer fit me and I needed to make new stuff, but I didn't have time or a bunch of money to throw at this. And the cotton velveteen can be found pretty inexpensively, and it forced me to really spend my time figuring out the right fit and construction techniques in order to get the right shape, rather than all of the fluff and the frills and the expenses and the beading and the lace and all of those extra things that I'm so used to putting on fancy gowns. I also made the jacket that I very briefly showed in the thumbnail of the Futurism video for one of my classes, which was meant to be an experimental class. So I wanted to try something outside of my comfort zone and really change up a historical garment into something more modern. So I took the standard 1890s sleeve shape, made it more exposed, made it out of organza, and for some reason I individually cut out each one of these sections and zigzagged by machine around each opening. The extra irony of this is that the next year was when I learned how to use the laser cutter. This is essentially teaching me the lesson that there might be better ways of going about some of these complicated things. I did, however, use the laser cutter the next year to make the 1790s ensemble because it has all of this pinked ruffled trim around the edge, and though I do have some appropriate pinking tools, that is still a very lengthy process, and this fabric frays a lot. So no matter what I did, it was going to fray out around those pinked edges. So I used the laser cutter for all the trim on this, and it was the best idea I think I've ever had when it comes to matching up modern technology and historic garments. It made it so much easier. I also needed some 1790s summer ensembles, so I remade that chemise gown into a base layer and made a very lightweight cotton silk blend for a red overdress, and then made this yellow overdress for a different base white gown with inked in instead of embroidered because I only had so much time. I was in grad school after all, there's only so many hours in the day. Late that winter I also ventured into the 1830s for the first time, going to a Dickens themed event with some friends and Made this massive red silk dress with huge sleeve puffs, as well as all of the accessories to go with it and all of the undergarments to go with it, because I had never done this time period before, so I had to start completely from scratch with that one. But I guess it was also the year of big sleeves, because that was the year that I made my 1895 gown as well, which I have talked about in my mistakes video before, because though it is absolutely beautiful, it is absolutely destroyed. The green feathers that I hand dyed did not hold their dye very well, and everything, me and the gown included, got covered in green dye. I've gotten most of it out and it has recovered. I've just learned to double check things better in the future and pay more attention when I'm working, so that way that doesn't happen again. In 2019, I finished up my thesis and graduated, moved halfway across the country, so I didn't have a ton of time to make very much that year. Abby did assist me in making the 1780s brown floral cotton jacket and petticoat, which might be familiar to you if you've been on my Instagram. I occasionally post some memory images of Abby and I when we worked together back at Colonial Williamsburg wearing what looks like the same jacket, but it is not. That is deception. We actually made that ensemble while I was working at Colonial Williamsburg in the millinery shop, which meant that it was the millinery shop's property, but we both loved it so much, and I managed to scrounge up enough of that fabric, which at that time had stopped being printed, I think it's now being printed again, in order to make this ensemble, so she helped me fit it and stitch it together before we went to costume college that year. I also had to make a very quick 1830s ensemble in a fabric that could be absolutely destroyed, so that was out of a really cheap printed cotton, and I made new sleeve puffs, interestingly enough filled with a modern mesh material that works weirdly just as well as the historically accurate filler methods for those puffs, but stays very lightweight and can dry out really quickly. I also made a very simple 1900s ensemble, which was off of the same pattern style that I had used over and over again for all of my steampunk garments. And this was to go up to Virginia City with some friends. So very simple, though it has a lovely antique lace added to it for a bit of accent. The next year, I had some grand plans. It was 2020, and I was settled in, and I was going to start making all of these beautiful costumes for all of these upcoming events that we were planning for the rest of the year, and I was dreaming big, and we all know how that went. But I did still manage to make a few things before I started up my YouTube channel, which I admittedly do kind of regret not actually getting video of the process of making these things. The first off is this 1900s ensemble, which was inspired by the artistic dress movement that was happening in Scotland around that era, where they were putting a lot of emphasis on these really interesting embroidered collars and bodices, and I wanted to try making one of those, and so I ended up realizing that as I did that I had nothing to wear it with and had to make an entire basic ensemble to go with it. I also made this 19-teens velvet cloak, which I got a lot of questions about when I wore it in short recently, so here's your closer look to that. It's a very simple construction and shaping process. There's really not that much to it, and I need to make some alterations so it doesn't just keep sliding down off my shoulders all of the time, but this was just, I'm going to make pieces to mix and match and be able to wear these things for different events in the future, because I don't really know what to make right now. And the answer ended up being focusing on a giant project that I had always wanted to do but had never felt like I could really manage, so I took my time making this 1860s evening gown. It's been on my list to make all the way back since 2011, but never thought I could really accomplish it. There's just too much complex trim in it. Instead, though, I took my time breaking down each layer of the trim, figuring out what I needed, and I ended up making all of the fringe that went around the bodice by getting silk chenille and little antique gold baubles and making up the fringe piece by piece by piece, gradually, slowly, painstakingly put this whole thing together. I'm pretty sure this is what kept me sane up until the point that I started a YouTube channel. So I'm glad I have it, though it has never really seen the light of day, as it were. I've never had an event to wear it to or a reason to wear it, because there really hasn't been much until recently. So hopefully some of the later pieces that I made will eventually get to be used in some format other than a few pictures. But I always appreciate the amount of knowledge that I have gained from every single piece on this list. It is nearly 70 things, and that is crazy for me to think about. So if you look at the things that I make now with expensive fabrics and really time-consuming, intensive techniques, it's because I have done all of these things before, and I have done them with a level of surety and audacity at points that got me through all of it. I guess as the audacity left me in my younger years, the knowledge picked up where that left off, and I have continued to make some really amazing things in my life that I am incredibly proud of, and now that I have gotten the chance to spend a little bit more time with them and share them with you, hopefully I am ready to let go of a lot of them and send them off to the next place in their adventure, because they shouldn't spend the rest of their life boxed away in my closet. I'm also running out of room. So thanks for joining me on my journey of costumes. I hope some of this will inspire you on yours.